What
Sweet.
the topic is. So I'm just hooking it up to YouTube right now.
Okay.
And then I'm going to mute this. Great. We are live.
Awesome. And I have my tea ready.
My tea too. Look at this.
Let me show you the mug I chose.
Therapy. Oh my God.
Therapy. It felt appropriate for the occasion.
Okay, so that's my next gift, right?
Easily arranged. Yes. I have so many fun mental health related mugs. Most of them are gifts.
I love it. I love it. I totally began that too. I think that's like one of those things that I realized, like, these small joys in our life, they really brighten your day. I have a special teacup that I bought from like TJ Maxx or something, and it lifts up my mood when I drink out of it every morning.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it just makes a whole difference. My favorite mug is one that says spit on the patriarchy, and it has a llama.
I smash the patriarchy.
Yes, but I felt like that's going to lead to a whole other discussion. So I was like, this feels good for today. Yeah.
Awesome. So, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Chai Chat. And, as you might know, today is World Suicide Awareness Day. And it's my first time doing something like this on the Muslim Suicide Researcher channel. And I'm so excited to have Areeba Siddiqui here with me. Areeba and I actually met when we were considerably younger, even though we're not old anymore yet. Still very young, super young people. So please don't think we are like, babies, but also don't think that we're old, because we actually know stuff. So we're here to share stuff with you, okay? So just have an open mind. And I met her at MSA West, which is the Muslim Student Association's West Conference, back in 2014.
I think it was in 2014 because it was before the hotline launched. Yeah.
Yes, and it was right when I got married. And so I remember, it's funny because my husband always jokes around with me like, you never remember our anniversary. And I'm always confused about the date because it's like 2/16/14.
Oh.
And I'm like, I like try to think of all these ways to remember it, and I never remember it. But yeah, that conference was right before we got married. And I remember meeting you, and you had this presentation about the AMALA Hopeline, and we're going to get into that.
Yes.
But let me just quickly do a little bit about the format of this conversation, and we'll get into your intro, inshallah, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. Let me take a deep breath.
Sip tea.
So the conversation we're going to have today is unscripted, unstructured. Areeba and I, we're really here as two people, as friends, as sisters, as professionals. We're both really passionate about suicide prevention. This conversation is meant to be sort of like a talk show. I really thought we could use a little chai chat and bring some casualness to such a heavy and sensitive and stigmatized topic. I certainly don't want to feel like I'm like, a hostage to this conversation. So we're going to take it easy. We're going to take it slow. It's chill, it's casual. Areeba, I met when she and her team founded the AMALA Hopeline, and now she's with Heart Women and Girls. So go ahead and introduce yourself, Areeba.
Yeah. So assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's really nice to be here talking with you today, Amelia. It's cool. We're professionals. We're also friends. And I think that just brings a really nice dynamic to the conversation, because we've had a lot of conversations, I think, on these topics just when we're chatting, right? My work background is a little bit all over the place. But I guess in terms of mental health, the things that are most relevant here, I founded the AMALA Hopeline with a team of my friends when in 2014, 2015 is when we launched it. We started working on it like maybe 2013, 2014. And that's, yeah, so we launched it in 2015, which is when I was finishing up undergrad. And then I continued to get my master's in social work, and I'm working on collecting hours towards licensure. And throughout the licensure process, I worked for Weave here in Sacramento, which is a like the local rape crisis domestic violence center. So I've worked in trauma, worked with folks that have experienced domestic or sexual violence. And yeah, and here we are today. So, and I've been involved with Heart, so as a trainer with them, and have done workshops within the Muslim community as well as outside of it on sexual violence in Muslim communities. And when I worked with other professionals or given trainings to other professionals, it's how to effectively support Muslim survivors. So those are sort of, that's sort of my background in doing mental health work within the Muslim community. Yeah.
That like literally, alhamdulillah, everything that we need.
Yeah.
I hope you all checked out the websites that I just showed, the AMALA Hopeline and Heart Women and Girls. I remember being one of the first people to grab your stickers. The fitna is patriarchy is fitna.
So great.
On my laptop. That's the only sticker I have. I love that one. I love it.
There's so many wonderful and creative people working at Heart, and they come up with some really great stuff.
Awesome. And you know what? I feel like we're just kind of in this whole zone in the Muslim community where like people like us, like, like we kind of grew into Americanness. We grew into Islam. We're like, I don't know if you were born here, but I was born here. Yeah.
Same.
And so, I feel that so many of us have reclaimed our narrative and have like really tackled some of these super stigmatizing subjects like suicide, domestic violence, sexual health, sexual violence, facing abuse in the community setting. So, these conversations are the ones that we should be having. And I guess maybe we can start off by asking each other, like, what, in terms of the stigma, do you think, like, how has that evolved? How has that conversation evolved? Because I'll tell you this, as the Muslim suicide researcher, when I launched my page on Facebook 2 years ago in November 2019, within the first like 2 days, I got like 300 people liking it and a whole bunch of people messaging me like, oh my God, we're so happy you're doing this work. And I actually, now when I go on to panels, I'm always like, oh yeah, there's, a lot less stigma around mental health. But then like when I talk about suicide, it's like,
yes. Yeah. So that's what I was going to say is I do feel like there's a lot less stigma. I think there's more comfort around talking about mental health to an extent where I'm seeing it incorporated even in like a halaqah that I attend on Saturday mornings, where the imam will actively incorporate like things around mental health when he's like talking about ayahs. And I was like, wow, like 6 years ago, I don't think I could go to a halaqah and expect the imam to like actively be tying in mental health, at least in my experience. And so, and then with friends too, just in daily conversations. And I think I will say that my experience is probably a little bit skewed like yourself. When you're actively working in mental health, I think people are more likely to come chat with you about it. But there is a lot more comfort around addressing these topics. There's still a lot, I think there's still a long ways to go. I personally have been in therapy like on and off since I was 19, right? And now I'm 29, so for the past decade. And more so actually in these past 2 years, like long term. And I'm very open about it. I talk about it a lot. And I think that's a really big piece that helps people feel comfortable. But when I have one-on-one conversations with folks who are like, I'm thinking about therapy, there's still usually a lot of blocks. Yeah. When they're making the personal decision for themselves. They'll always say like, oh, therapy is great, like I recommend it. But when it comes to them, folks themselves, I often see there's still a lot of blocks, and a lot of them are related to that stigma. A lot of it is like, but do I really need it? you know, like, and a lot of like minimization of the challenges that they're dealing with. And sometimes there is that, you know, I think one big part of stigma, specifically in the Muslim community, is like the ties between seeking mental health help and like where your spiritual help is, right? Because there's often accusations that if you're in need of mental health help, your relationship with God isn't where it should be, and that's what you should be working on. And so these are, I think, kind of the things that are still coming up. Definitely progress. People are talking about it, but I think the stigma is still coming up when it comes to actually like reaching out for services. Yeah.
You know, like on that point of, you know, your relationship with God isn't strong enough, or
Yeah.
you know, whatever version of that people say. You know, sometimes it's a generational thing, right? Like I've seen, you know, mostly the older generation say that, but I wouldn't be surprised hearing that from people even now, right? Like practicing young Muslims. Like, is that what you're
Yeah.
saying? Like,
Yeah, because it's this very internalized message. You know, even if it's not sometimes coming out overtly, like I'm hearing, maybe they're not even directly saying it, but I'm hearing it, right?
yeah,
When they're sharing with me.
that is so key. Actually,
Yeah.
that is so key. What you just touched on right now.
Yeah.
I need people out there to really understand that. Yeah, it's, even though it could be an older generation mentality, you're so right. Like it's the internalization that gets
Yeah.
passed down, and then you know what it is? It's truly the passing of shame. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
and you know, whatever attachments we've made to like the value judgments and the construct of mental health, whatever that means to people gets also passed down.
Yeah.
And you know, the behaviors and everything that we have towards seeking services, you know, we underutilize services. So for example, in other groups too, like racial minorities, for example, Asians are the least likely racial group to seek mental health support.
Right.
And you know, how many Asians do we have in the Muslim community? A quarter of us are of South Asian origin,
Right.
and another quarter are from West Asia, also known as the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
So about half of us actually meet that demographic, if you think about it, like from a more broad perspective. And a more so if you think about like from a research perspective, like what cultural norms and cultural values really are normalized in behavior.
Right.
Like, you know, we I think the Muslim world shares a lot of, you know, values that are parallel in pan-Asian culture to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, I mean, what's the number one Muslim country in the world, the most populous country? Indonesia.
Yeah.
So
I was like, don't pass me on geography right now. But yeah. Yeah.
don't worry about it, don't worry about it. But you know,
Um,
I think we often forget that the Asian world is largely the Muslim world. I mean, only like about less than 20% of the Muslim world is of Arab origin.
right.
So
Yeah.
the vast majority of us are not Arab. And so
Right.
we've got some of the top 5 most populous Muslim countries on earth are Asian. Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh,
Right.
right? That's 4 right there. And
Yeah.
I think that also, and by the way, Pakistan is the number 1 country of origin for Muslim immigrants to this country.
Hmm.
So, you know, when you think about really Asians underutilizing mental health services, and the stigma or the weakness that's perceived in seeking help, you know, I don't think that that's particularly just a Muslim issue, but when you think about like intersectionality, I mean, let's think about how many different kind of identities and cultural exposures we're having and internalizing messages from all
Right.
of those groups, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a big thing, is even if sometimes we're not even fully like consciously aware of it, like that's very much there, because this is the message that we're hearing from our parents, right? This is the message that we're hearing from our just the elders in our community in general. Um, and so it's there. And I think like it comes to light when we're feeling guilt or we're feeling shame around the way that we're practicing and presenting as Muslims. And then we'll just think like, oh, if I'm not fully where I should be as a Muslim, like that's probably why I'm feeling all these negative emotions. That's probably why I'm not feeling great. And I think I hear that a lot from folks. And I've caught that like thinking pattern within myself too sometimes, and I have to like really stop and like actively remind myself like, we're all human. Like we're all are, and spirituality is not always like this, right? It's gonna be like this. And mental health will also be like this. And there are two aspects of health that definitely interact, but mental health is not fully dependent on spiritual health, right? And vice versa. So,
Love that.
all parts of health interact, right? Like
Oh,
they're all dependent on one another: physical health, mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, financial health, like so many different pieces that interact. So when someone is experiencing mental health and we're only as a community pinning it on spiritual health, like that's problematic. Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
As I said in my interview with Lubna Mullah, which if check it out, it's the one right before this one.
Yeah.
The idea that spiritual health is all encompassing is an ideology that is rooted in what I would assume this understanding of traditional Islam, right? Islam is so holistic that the spiritual framework and foundation within which Islam originates and proliferates and maintains itself is in and of itself self-sufficient and fulfilling. And so, yes, we agree with that. So that's not what we're saying, right? That's not what we're saying. We're not against that. We agree with that. However, what we're saying is just as there's a role for medicine and there's a role for any type of pathology involved with identifying disease, identifying illness, and intervening, right? Mm-hmm. We're saying that we're just offering that particular element to plug into the greater spiritual health, right? Because, really, I think that what I had said was, I came full circle from zero spirituality to researching everything about Muslim mental health to coming back to like 100% spirituality. And straight up, like I got in touch with one of my sheikhas who I hadn't talked to in like, I don't know, 7-8 years, close to a decade. And recently had to talk to her actually, because I had recent kind of epiphanies around the nature of evil and trauma. I mean, let's talk about that, because I think people do sometimes, just in my defense, I think the so-called traditional Muslim community can sometimes view me and science as a threat to maintaining tradition. I'm saying that not because it's my opinion, but because I was actually told that by the nation's leading community organizing student director at UCLA. So he runs community programs office at UCLA. He's had 15 plus years of experience in that role, and then another 10 on that campus working with student groups of all backgrounds, including Muslim students. So he's worked with African Student Union, MECHA, which is Latinx students, right? And, he said to me that basically what I represent to a lot of people who come from a more traditional background is I'm a threat to maintaining tradition because I have a lot of open-mindedness and a lot of critical thinking. And I'm just sitting there like, wait, since when were those?
Where do I start?
He said,
yeah,
it's not necessarily about them being bad qualities, but the fact that those qualities alone put under question your loyalty to that particular group. And essentially what I extended from what he said was, I said, well, I think what you're talking about is in loyalty to the tradition, right? And there's a certain level of, I guess, understanding that, okay, yeah, we're going to talk about mental health. So some people may perceive it as a threat to the conversations around spiritual health.
Oh, interesting.
I think that there, that there's like a broader theme of like secularizing knowledge, and people are trying to really use the Islamic lens to see the world in every way. And I don't think that I think that we should do that. We should see the world through that Islamic lens, but we should acknowledge that there are other lenses there, which we can unite with the Islamic lens. They're not in competition with each other at all. They're in fact complementary to each other.
Right. I mean, that's kind of reminding me of like, and again, like I don't have a background in like studying Islam. So like, please, yeah, like
I went to Islamic school and I went to Islamic school. I just to kind of put my creds out there, because I forgot to introduce myself.
Yeah.
So I went to Islamic school since preschool to 6th grade. I went to middle school and high school in an all-white city in Huntington Beach, California. And then I went to Irvine High School, and also in Orange County, California. And then I went to UCLA and I became vice president of the MSA. I was the outreach director. I was the Dawah director. I used to wear hijab. I studied abroad in Bilkent University, Ankara, Turkey, and traveled to like 14 countries in the world, most of them Muslim majority countries during Ramadan. I read Quran. I've memorized Quran. I read with tajweed. You know, sometimes I have to feel like I have to qualify.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I also went to an Islamic school. We haven't talked about that. That can be a thing. So yeah, I mean, I have that, but I just remember growing up hearing that like, so long as something doesn't contradict Islam, like we're welcome to embrace it. And I remember like hearing that with like, even with taking things from other faiths and like, you know, that aren't contradicting faith. So I feel like that same thing can be applied with mental health, right? There's things that, I mean, and with mental health, it's just so it's necessary that we like keep that framework in mind. But I definitely hear what you're saying about people viewing it as like secularizing faith tradition. And I think that that's just a part of, at least in the States or in the West in general, like the Muslim experience is everyone is trying to find this balance, right, between like holding on to tradition, right, and also embracing culture here. And
something, Areeba, like what is tradition? Because like, can we just demystify this for once? Because you know, honestly, why I even use that word? Because I hate using that word, right?
Right, right.
Well, it's not a unified language, but the imam of my local Muslim community used that word to describe himself.
Right.
And we consider ourselves traditionalists. So I'm like, what does that mean?
I mean, I guess the way that cultural and faith was practiced by our parents and ancestors, right, prior to coming to the States. When people use the word tradition, that's what they're using. And there's obviously a lot of mix of cultural values in there. And there's a lot of mix of so many, there's so many layers, right? Like, even like, you know, from Pakistan, you can see like remainders of like British imperialism, like in culture, right? So you're gonna, I mean, a great example, and like just stop me if I'm getting too tangential, is even like how like light skin is favored, right, in Pakistani culture. That's obviously coming from like colonial, like British imperialism roots, right? But that's become like a cultural thing. And when people like within, like when like folks are seeking partners for marriage, that still comes up, like even in this day and age, right? And it's ridiculous, and it has nothing to do with faith, but it's a cultural value that's being like,
girl, let me tell you something. I have lost so many suitors because I'm a brown skinned Pakistani girl who doesn't have like a traditional Pakistani name, who doesn't have like a traditional Pakistani like upbringing. Like I grew up with a single mother who with a dad who had schizophrenia. We were super stigmatized in the community and poor. And you know, so on that end, I'm like unqualified, right? And then on the other end, now I'm like getting a PhD at Johns Hopkins. I'm developing this whole movement, this like social movement around mental health and being out there and open about these topics. And it's funny because I'm also overqualified in that regard too.
right.
So like when I was getting higher education, you know, like people would always say like, oh, you can get educated, don't get too educated because then your pool lessens, because the patriarchy tells us that.
Right.
What does it tell us?
Yeah.
I mean,
just, you don't want to be, you don't want to be overqualified. You don't want to be too educated, too expressive, too, right? Like all of those things.
Too critical thinker, too open-minded. Yeah,
Yeah.
don't be too open-minded
Yeah.
because it's a threat to the penis patriarchy.
Yes.
Because,
Yeah.
what we're going to do is essentially challenge male authority,
Yeah.
is what that is saying,
Right. Right.
Like
And a lot of that gets packaged as religion too, and like perpetuated as religion. And it's so problematic. It's so problematic because if you actually look at the faith tradition, there are so many things that are truly liberating for a woman. But those things, they're just like kind of brushed aside because the patriarchal narrative has just kind of taken over. Yeah. I mean,
and you know what? Let me
see it
also
everywhere. Yeah.
this same mentality that contributes to domestic violence in
Yeah.
our communities, also known as intimate partner violence. And there's a scientific distinction between those two terms. So
Right.
domestic violence can actually include, domestic, as in like people in that household or people in that particular social family unit. Intimate partner violence is, between two people who consider themselves partners and engage in intimate activities, right? So, and of all kinds, not just sexual. And so, and those terms also were made to be inclusive of non-heteronormative relationships and dynamics and family and stuff like that. And you know what? There's I worked with a researcher from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, and Dr. Bushra Sabri, and we looked at immigrant women and intimate partner violence in immigrant women who are from these Muslim majority countries and also from majority the Latin American world. And there was suicidality connected to intimate partner violence.
Yeah.
So this
That
is
makes
literally
sense.
patriarchy making us suicidal.
Yes. Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so unfortunate, just the impacts that have. Yeah. And I'm sure when you came to that presentation about us starting the hotline, like we talked about suicide being like a primary push. And what had happened was we had heard, so, I'm born and raised in Sacramento, and that's kind of where I was doing this work. And I was doing youth work at the local mass center. And I was noticing like a need with the youth that I was working with, because many of them did not feel comfortable speaking to their parents about certain things, right? And they were struggling in their mental health and they didn't know who to go to, right? And this is going to tie into isolation playing such a huge role in suicidality as well. And I think also ties to your point about how you were so stigmatized because of all of these reasons and you were feeling isolated, right? And I know that you have some lived experience around this topic. So I think that isolation is a big piece. But what was happening is, like, while I was doing this youth work and my team and I, we were identifying like, okay, there's a need for an accessible resource for Muslim youth. We had also heard that a nearby community, and I'm just going to keep things as anonymous as possible, because we never fully got consent from the families involved with this, but there was a nearby community, small Muslim community, and within 2 months, and I believe this occurred in 2012 or 2013, within 2 months, there were, I was hearing different numbers from folks within the community, but I was hearing from some 4, from some 6, from some 7 suicides within 2 months, all Muslim individuals, majority of them males between 18 to 24. There was one woman as well in her late 20s, early 30s, where we didn't get the full story, but just based on the pieces that I heard, it felt like there was some level of domestic violence involved. But again, we were never able to get like a conclusive narrative there. But just with my background and the bits and pieces I was gathering, that's what it sounded like. And for the remainder of the folks, the stories that we were able to gather, the one commonality between all of the narratives, and I think we were able to confirm 4. But again, like, it was really hard to find this information because the families, like these suicides occurred, the families were carrying a lot of shame around it, it appears, and we're not telling the community that the individual and their family had passed due to suicide, right? Like, I hear a lot of like, oh, they passed in their sleep, or, things like that, type stories. but we were able to confirm 4, asking around, kind of getting some information, and kind of doing research informally, to get the stories.
Sorry, can you talk about what you mean by confirming the stories? Like, what does that process entail? Like, what were you looking for?
I guess, like, the families themselves did not come forward and say, like, this is what happened with our son or with our family member, or, whoever it is. It was more so like friends that I know within the community, what they had heard, right? What they had asked. Some of them had connections to like Muslim leadership. So the information they were able to kind of get from leadership that had a little bit more insight. That's sort of how we gathered this information. But yeah, that's how it was gathered. And so the common theme in all of these is all of these individuals were feeling very isolated and feeling very alone. And we're just trying to find community. Didn't feel it within their families, didn't feel it within their friend groups. Tried finding like friend groups, tried creating that community for themselves and didn't have the best experiences. And then the final resort that I heard in a lot of these stories is they attempted to go to the mosque to feel like a sense of community. But because they did not look Muslim, whatever that means to those communities, maybe they had tattoos or piercings, maybe they had whatever it was, that didn't quote look Muslim.
Yep.
We all know that there is no Muslim look. There is a variety of ways that a Muslim can present. A lot of diversity in practice, lots of cultural backgrounds, but whatever it was, they didn't look Muslim to that community. They were turned away, and then they just felt so isolated and alone that they took their lives. And that it really breaks my heart. Like, I know this story, I've told it so many times, and I still get emotional every time I share it, because it just really breaks my heart that someone was feeling so alone, and like a little bit of kindness would have gone such a long way. And our communities just don't always know how to do that. Yeah. So
Deep breath.
yeah. So I just think I don't even know these families, but it's just the pain that I feel when I hear these stories is
it's vicarious trauma at the
it
very
is. Yeah.
Because part of doing this work really, required me to understand what self-care looked like, because I'm around death and suicide all day. That's my world.
Yeah.
And I've absorbed so many of these stories, and I'm sure you have too. And I was actually trying to find the news article of yours that I'd like to start sharing so everyone can see. This was when Areeba was featured in the news, and it's from 2017. AMALA Hopeline offers much needed crisis counseling for Muslim youths. And actually the story behind us is I reached out to Areeba about 2 to 3 years ago when I was first applying for my NIH grant, which alhamdulillah, I got. Woo, woo, woo. And Areeba, honestly, you played a critical role in all of this, because although, we didn't work together on this grant, your work essentially provided the anecdotal and narrative evidence required for me to be like, you know what, I don't have evidence right now. So like, how am I going to apply for grant funding when I don't have data or research? Like, you need research to apply to research funding. So that's another story, which if you're interested in understanding how that works, check out my article on theconversation.com, which was just published today. And I will also include that link in the video. But look at this. This is what Areeba said. Oh, and of course it's completely
blurred, of course.
Blurred.
Oh, it might be when you're sharing through Zoom for certain.
Gotcha. Well, yeah. I remember what the article said, and I used it in my dissertation presentation, which I remember texting you and being like, Areeba, can I put your picture in my dissertation? The key quote was about Muslim Americans having to reconcile multiple identities, which in other words is intersectionality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that word is like such a buzzword, and I think like people don't quite really fully grasp it. So let me just take like a second to define it. You know, intersectionality is the concept that our identities, you know, for me particularly, like South Asian or brown, Muslim, woman, you know, each one of these interacts with the other in terms of how they're connected to structural violence, structural oppression. So the brownness or the South Asianness connects to my racial minority status. The Muslimness connects to the Islamophobia and being stigmatized as a Muslim. And obviously a woman, we don't have as much power as men or other genders. So, you know, this concept of multiple mechanisms of oppression kind of working against us isn't new. It's existed since the early 90s. And it's only now really gaining traction in the research world. But, you know, that is what I'm sure you were hearing in the calls, right? Like, tell me a little bit about the calls that you have been receiving over the past 6 to 7 years.
Yeah. So I have not been actively taking calls maybe for the past couple of years. But I can share what I was seeing when I was taking calls. There is often that identity piece of like trying to reconcile like Muslim and American identities, almost like they're mutually exclusive, and it's hard to kind of do both at the same time. And so that's a very common theme. I will say there's a lot of like, again, isolation. Like, I'm struggling with this, but I don't know who I can talk to about it in my life. I can't talk to my family. I can't talk to my friends because I'm scared of being judged. That's something that I hear all the time. And even like outside of the Muslim community, right? They're like, oh, I have friends who are Muslim, but they just won't understand. And I'll get judged on that, in that sphere in other ways. So there's this constant, like, I just don't know where to go. I don't know where to fit. And just a lack of safe spaces where they can fully express like the wholeness of their humanity and like what they're experiencing. And when I train folks that are coming to the hotline, because that's probably how I'm most actively involved at this point with the line, is training new volunteers. I always talk about one of the most common types of calls that we get, and this is going to tie to what we were talking about earlier. I call it the guilt call, which is someone calling feeling really guilty about something that they did that they are saying is like not Islamic, and they did it, and now they're carrying a lot of guilt and shame to an extent that it's debilitating, where they're unable to focus on what they need to be focusing on in their life, whether they're in school or at work or in relationships. Like, that guilt is weighing so heavily that they're having a hard time, right? Doing these daily acts of living, right? And so a lot of isolation, a lot of guilt, right? And I'm gonna just go ahead and frame that guilt as spiritual trauma. And I think that's what I'm seeing.
Can we take a moment to absorb that? Guilt equals spiritual trauma.
Yeah. Like, guilt is an emotion that has its place, right? And even if you look in the Islamic in Islam, right? Like, when we feel guilty, we're feeling guilty for a reason. And there's something that we learn from that guilt, right? We're doing something that's not aligning with our inner values. But for guilt to weigh so heavily on a person, that's where they're having a hard time focusing on what they're supposed to be doing or what they're doing in their life, right? That is where we have to stop and think like, okay, this is a lot. This is a lot of guilt. And this is spiritual trauma. This is like a lot of internalized shame and guilt and messages about how one should be. And if they veer from it even a little, there's something inherently wrong with them, right? Like, that's kind of the message that folks are getting. So I would say that a lot of the calls that we get are, centered around spiritual trauma, and like reconciling pieces of identity and isolation. I would say those are probably, and this is just me going off of my own experience. I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but that's what I see. And this is even outside of the hotline. Like, when I think, again, I'm sure you relate to this, Amelia, as someone who does like mental health work, like sometimes I get messages from folks that I don't know, or, and these are the themes that I hear.
Yeah. Thank you so much, because like, thank you so much, because this is what you just did, is take some of the points that I've been making, and you just packaged it in this really easy, concise way to understand. So spiritual trauma, right? I mean, let me zoom back even further. So, you know, my role here is to talk from a research perspective. So when we think about guilt, guilt is one of the core elements of depression. And it's also a core element of, and depression and suicidality are interconnected. In fact, when we do screenings for depression, there are several screening questions in different measures, like different types of instruments that we use, that have at least one version of a question pertaining to suicide. So, for example, there will be like, oh, you know, do you feel hopeless, or do you feel like hurting yourself? Those are questions that typically appear on depression screeners. Some of which include the PHQ-9, which is used in medical settings, and then the Edinburgh Depression Scales for postpartum. But Center for Epidemiological Research on Depression, the CERD, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't. I'm a little rough on the edges right now, but those measures directly capture if someone is feeling suicidal, and that's intimately connected to depression. And in the other questions around depression, they will ask you, like, do you feel guilty? Do you feel like a burden? Do you feel like you're gonna bring, you know, shame? You know, those are the questions that are underlying some of these other questions. Right. And so the shame aspect is critical because, you know, I made a joke, and it's funny because like I just said this without really thinking. But when I was in the conversation with Lubna on just 2 days ago on Wednesday, you know, she said, why are people so ashamed of suicide or thinking of, or like or about mental health, when like if you break your arm, like no one's going to be ashamed of that. And out of just like just kind of reactive comment, I told her, unless you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing, then you should be ashamed of breaking your actually, when you think about it, it's similar to suicide and suicidal behaviors and self-injurious behaviors and self-sabotaging behaviors, like, you know, binge drinking, binge substance use, binge eating. Those are behaviors that are often things that make us feel guilty about ourselves. And so we feel ashamed. And also they're super not, you know, accepted as healthy behaviors in broad society, but then in Muslim society, you're extremely dehumanized for engaging in those behaviors. And that's what I love about you talking about the safe space, because like, what is a safe space? Where, you know, I actually found this really cool, and if I remember the website, I would love to screen share it, but there's this really cool organization in Texas that started up like a community organization for Muslims and belonging. And you know that's like a huge factor in suicide. In fact, that's what my research looks at, is to what degree do you feel socially connected to this particular group of people, any particular group of people, because that level of feeling belonging and accepted for who you are, like not just parts of you, right? Not just like the Jumua version of you or the Ramadan version of you, right? But the whole version of you outside of those contexts. How are you being accepted in society, in Muslim American society?
Right. Yeah. I mean, sorry, I'm really caught on the guilt and shame piece. Like, I will say, like, whenever, like, any emotion is an indicator, right? Like, it's something like when you feel an emotion, it's a good time to stop and think, like, where is this coming from? What is this telling me? Right. That's how I look at emotions. And with guilt and shame, you know, I said earlier, like, it can be an indicator that we're doing something that doesn't align with our inner values, but it's more complex than that. So I just want to say, like, sometimes guilt and shame are coming from other places, like cultural conditioning, right? So, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Amelia, as like a, you know, are you the eldest daughter? But just being a daughter and an immigrant.
The youngest, and I have two older sisters who are 10 and 12 years older than me.
Okay. But I think you just understand, like, being a daughter, like in an immigrant household, there's always this like extra level of like pressure and responsibility. And you are expected to set aside your needs for the collective, right? Especially as a woman. I think for everybody in a collectivist community, but I think especially for women. And so sometimes like I will feel guilt when I'm just trying to set a boundary to protect myself that I have every right to set. Right. But oh, right. So there's so many layers. But in the Muslim community too, there's a lot of these like cultural ideas and cultural conditioning that is creating guilt in people as well. Right. As so yeah, I think our community, there's so many reasons and angles as to why we might feel guilt and shame. And I would just encourage folks that if you're feeling guilt or shame, or if you have a friend that's being really weighed down by guilt and shame and you're trying to support them, is like help them unpack where that guilt and shame is coming from. Because yes, like you're mentioning, Amelia, like if that guilt and shame goes unchecked, there can be very severe consequences, right? Folks can feel depression, and it can increase risk of suicidality. So it's really important that both of these be explored. And I think it's just, again, like I said, one of the most common calls, the point that I teach about it when I'm training folks is the guilt call, right?
Yes, because, you know, connecting back to the guilt and shame and spiritual trauma,
yeah,
which I honestly think is like the gem of this entire conversation so far. But the spiritual trauma thing, like I talked about that in my call with Lubna. You know, let's think about spiritualistic in our collectivist community society, right? You know, we have these collectivist norms where all of our survival is intertwined, and we're really, you know, we're not individualistic. We don't want to, you know, but the more assimilated you are, the more individualistic you become, and your behaviors too. But in terms of the spirituality thing, the trauma doesn't always happen to you as an individual. It happens to your entire community, right?
right.
So, for example, all these like shayukh, imams, like whatever, khateebs, you know, who have these acts of violence against women,
Yeah.
you know, that is something that isn't just affecting that particular woman, but other people who identify as women are collectively feeling this sense of vicarious trauma, this like, oh my God, I'm connected to her. And so it becomes community spiritual trauma and community shame and community guilt. And so on top of what an individual might be feeling, right, there's also this is kind of like up in the air, and we're kind of breathing this toxic air all the time. And so part of what I always tell people is like, try to control your environment as much as possible. You know, it's something that, unfortunately, it is something that takes privilege. You can't always be in control of what environments you're in, right? You can't always choose what job to get, what boss you have, you know, where you live. But I do believe you can choose which people you allow to enter your life.
Definitely. You can build your own community for yourself, right? You can choose your community. You can choose where you're engaging. And with the spiritual trauma piece, I feel like I see spiritual trauma everywhere. Like I can't look somewhere and not see it within the Muslim community, outside of the Muslim community. I see it everywhere. And I think, and usually the source of that spiritual trauma is other folks in the community that are identifying as religious or have like leadership positions misusing their power to abuse and hurt other people, or it's just this constant moral policing that's like very prevalent and is almost taught to us growing up, right? You went to an Islamic school, I went to an Islamic school. There was this very much like, you know, if you see something wrong, correct it, right? Like you have the right to like just butt in and like correct people, like, you know, and like as I've gotten older, like I've engaged in conversations with people around like, okay, what does it mean when you see something wrong to step up? Because it's coming up with a lot of like moral policing, with like little things like nitty gritty, like very detail oriented, like ritual practice stuff. But when there's actual injustices happening in the community, not a lot of people are speaking up. You know, so there's just, wow, I just feel like I just went on a tangent, but there's.
Can I insert really quick?
Yeah.
I actually wrote it down because I'm like, I can't lose this. The spiritual trauma, the guilt, the shame, to me are all remnants of colonization. Because when you think about, and the policing especially, actually, right?
Yeah.
Think about like where we're coming from. I mean, South Asia in particular, right? India was like under the British Empire. And let's not even get into the Brits. Like, let's just not even get, because I don't want to give
Yeah.
any
That's,
time or anything. But
yeah.
the way we were treated, right? We were slaves. And the mentality is that we defer to them and just there's like an automatic worth value judgment about what they're worth and what their value is and what our value is. And it's actually so implicit and so subconscious that even I have found myself interacting with people of like British origin or white or whatever in America and around the world and just automatically think that they're smarter, they're more resourced, they're this, they're that, and I'm less and I'm not as worthy. And you know what? The mentalities that happen and the history that happened to us and our families, we were policed. I mean, if you look at the United States history and where policing actually came from, it was slave patrols. And the whole point of actually having police was to make sure the slaves were doing their labor.
Mm-hmm.
And that notion of policing is community violence, because what you're doing is you're taking individuals who are supposed to be a part of community, and those communities are composed of individual members. And theoretically, the idea is that each member has an equal amount of power. And so power is kind of a shared concept. And the construct of power doesn't have any notion of individualism. Rather, it's more of power sharing and decision making as a collective. And those values have disintegrated into allotting certain individuals to institutions, which we've just made up, right? Like anyone
That's a powerful point. Yeah, I got, especially looking at that in the Muslim community. Like I always bring this up with people. I'm like, if you look at Islam, it's an equalizer. Like everybody has equal access to God. There's no saints. There's no figure that has special access that everybody else has, right? Like it's designed in a way where everybody has equal access, but the community stays putting people on pedestals and like giving certain people, right? And that is what creates it's two things, right? It's like the community putting folks on pedestals, and then also those folks not having met themselves deeply enough to know that they're abusing their powers, you know? Like and to not understand like the weight that what they're saying and doing is carrying. Because even if it's not like very overt and clear like abuse of power, they are saying things that are isolating people from the Muslim community, right? I can speak as a survivor of sexual violence, right? Like I've experienced sexual violence, unfortunately, more than once in my life from like different people. And like I'm going to say like the past 2-3 years, I haven't been able to like go to the masjid because I have felt just recently I started like re-engaging very slowly but surely in spaces where I know that I feel fully comfortable. But I'm going to say like, because when the Kavanaugh proceedings were happening and the Me Too movement was happening and folks in the Muslim community were talking more openly about sexual violence, there were so many religious leaders putting out their opinions about like, what are certain Islamic rulings around sexual violence? And I'm like, that's not even the conversation we need to be having. The conversation we need to be having is sexual violence is happening, right? And like, we need to center survivors. But there was so much insensitivity in the way that this topic was being addressed in the Muslim community, right? And as a survivor who can be seen as someone that maybe isn't fitting into the cookie cutter, like Muslim box, I felt very isolated sometimes. I felt like, okay, did I do something wrong? Should I have been quote dressed differently? There's so much victim blaming. There's so much focus on rules and instead of like the actual humanity of people. And like I felt isolated, even if the people who were putting these messages out, they weren't actively trying to isolate people, but they were careless in the way that they talked about topics. And it left people feeling isolated. And when I spoke up, I remember posting just about like how I was feeling as a survivor during the Kavanaugh proceedings, and especially within the Muslim community, about how sexual violence was being talked about in the Muslim community, I talked about how isolated I was feeling, and I was just putting out there, like, if you're also feeling isolated, like, I understand, and do what you need to do, take a step back, chop off social media for a while, like, don't engage if you don't need to. You know, like, I put this out, and I got pushback for posting that from folks, like, labeled an emotional feminist. I was like, you know what? I am both a feminist and emotional, so I don't take offense to that. But it was being phrased as like a very, like I'm not being logical. Like, I can be logical and emotional at the same time, sir. But like there was just like this whole like, yeah. And I like, that is what contributes to my spiritual trauma, hands down. And I have to really, like, I had to take some time to step back and like reclaim my faith for myself. And that meant taking a step back from the community, because there are just so many layers of like remnants of colonialism and patriarchal norms and things that are just so there, like in like community spaces, that I was like, I'm hurt. I feel like I'm hurting myself every time I engage in the community. I need to step back, and I need to reclaim this for myself. I need to just read the Quran by myself. I need to like read things by myself, and I need to like do the therapy and heal. I need to do that.
I love you, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease your difficulties and foster your healing. He is El Shafi, and I hope that whoever is watching can feel a sense of vicarious healing too.
I hope so.
Because
I love that word, vicarious healing. I love that.
I'm trying to start. I don't know if it's going to pick up, but I've been trying to start it. And in terms of the term isolation, not everyone, even though that's so like accurate, and in science we use that particular terminology, it's also related to the cousin words of like feeling alone, feeling like you're the only one, feeling like, and also related to, I think, gaslighting. So the idea that your experiences didn't happen or are not real is a form of is the definition of gaslighting. But the gaslighting happens to such a great degree. I've come to realize that my experience in the Muslim community is chronic invalidation. So that's another scientific term for gaslighting. And that's actually tied to suicide too, and just poor mental health overall. Chronic invalidation, and those are also kind of multisyllabic words, so let me break that down a little bit. Chronic invalidation is the idea that when you have a feeling or you have an experience or whatever it is that you're sharing with someone, and you want to express that, and you express it, and other people hear it, they don't validate it. They don't acknowledge it, that, oh yeah, that's true, or that exists, or I see your point, or I see you, I hear you. That understanding of acknowledging your full existence is what's happening. Is we're invisibilizing our voices, we're invisibilizing our presence. And like you, Areeba, I had to take a step back, just like you said. Every time you enter that space, it's just trauma. I had to leave the Muslim community, and I have begun like a very slow, intentional, methodical, and strategic process of re-entering the community. And I have to take the community in dosages. Because, the work
I totally get it. Sorry. No, continue. I'm just saying I understand. Yeah.
The work that I'm doing is a lot. And then I'm dealing with my own spiritual trauma. And just like you, like, I wake up in the morning, and within the first 5 minutes of waking up, I'm opening my Quran app, I'm reading Quran. And I lost my relationship with Quran for so many years. I still to this day cannot get myself to pray 5 daily prayers, because just that action of that alone makes me feel like there's trauma still stuck in my body
Yeah.
of being in those spaces. And, we have the books like, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
That really, I don't think people really understand that science can actually be used to uncover spiritual elements of our behavior. And really,
Definitely. It's just so interesting because I feel like even in work that I've done as a therapist, right, with folks, and I haven't worked exclusively with Muslim folks. I've worked with folks from a variety of backgrounds with a variety of like spiritual framings. I see spiritual trauma there too. And there's always like unpacking of it. And I'm always like telling people, like, you can define spirituality for yourself. Like you can, like, yeah, you can reclaim it for yourself, I guess is a better word than redefine. You can reclaim it for yourself in a way that works for you, because it's just been, unfortunately, in so many people's experiences, it's been tainted, right, by other individuals, right, who are trying to hold on to power and control.
Yep.
Or just have not a lot of awareness around the harm that they're causing because they haven't worked on themselves. They haven't like built self-awareness. And so it's like it's unhealed. You're just around a lot of unhealed people that are projecting their own
Yep.
thing and packaging it as religion sometimes. And
Yep.
and it's hurting people and it's isolating people. And these things are leading to folks feeling depressed, right? Feeling traumatized and feeling, suicidal ideations,
Yep.
increased suicidality.
Yeah, the idea that people are wounded and trying to be and are put in positions where they're supposedly supposed to help other people. I mean, the thing is, like, you were talking about the self-awareness. Um, I think this ties into another point that we should really bring up. I think that there is an epidemic of narcissism that is affecting our community. And I've noticed this for a really long time. And it was only when I realized it was in my family that I was like, holy shit, I need to like take a whole full step back and look at this from an objective, unbiased perspective. So actually followed some of these protocols that experts say you should do when you're working with people who have narcissism personality disorder, or even traits that are narcissistic, right? So the first thing is no contact. And a narcissist, a person with narcissism, to humanize the language, not just a narcissist, but a person with narcissism will not recognize that there is something wrong with them, or that there is something about them that needs to be changed. A person, and therefore lacks quote unquote self-awareness, because there's this idea that if I'm aware of who I am and I recognize that there's issues about me, then that makes me a bad person, and I'm not a bad person. And so there's insecurities attached to that. So the narcissistic trauma is really something that is like a reclaiming of their power. So they want to just constantly be in a zone of control and power and feel good and make themselves be really, really perceived as like a high person, as an important, powerful person. And those particular qualities that I just mentioned, like being perceived as like, someone, like the image factor, right? Image is huge in our community. Everyone is all about image, and the mainstream narrative is like, what titles do you hold? Are you, what power do you have? How much money do you have? What car do you drive? What clothes do you wear? What's your position? Who do you know? What do you know? Do you have a mic? Those are things that people are noticing all the time. And so there's almost like a culture that fosters this narcissism to happen. There's like a phenomenon of people like falling in love with themselves and then having a codependency on members of the community to fill their supply, their narcissistic supply, which is, oh, validate me and how powerful I am and how awesome I am and this and that. And then if I encounter someone who doesn't validate me in that way or doesn't see me in the way that I see myself, then I cut them off, right? And so that narcissism is not just something that affects individuals. I argue that truly it's something that has affected our community as a whole. And I can talk a little bit more about that and how childhood trauma and oppression systems are related. But what
Yeah,
do you?
I'm just curious to hear, Amelia, like, what is your definition of narcissism? Because I know there is like clinical diagnosis, and then there's like a more colloquial use of the word. And so, like,
Yes.
what is, yeah, how are you defining narcissism?
I don't have off the top of my head, because this is not my area of expertise, but it does tie into a lot of the stuff that I work in terms of mental health. But my understanding is that there's certain characteristics that are ascribed to narcissistic personality.
Right.
One of them is lack of empathy.
Yes.
So, a person is unable to relate to, someone else when they're feeling either emotionally pain or physically pain. Another one is sense of entitlement. They believe that they can get privileges that are unearned and because of who they are.
Yeah.
And another one is self-centeredness, the conversation or whatever that, their understanding of themselves depends on other people essentially worshiping them
Yeah.
without being like, so without, being like this, but like there's a certain expectation that you're going to be held in a certain light or have certain esteem.
Yeah. 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 So I think I agree with those. I agree with those three things. Like, I definitely see those in people a lot in our community. I always get a little hesitant using the word narcissism because I think some of it is my background. Like, I've worked with abuse a lot, and a lot of survivors will use the term narcissist or narcissism to label their abuser. And I feel like that takes accountability away from the perpetrator, because it's just saying like, oh, well, they're just the survivor is doing it to because they're feeling a lot of blame, right? The survivor is feeling a lot of blame, like, I did things to bring this abuse onto me, and this helps them deflect it and say like, oh, it's not me, it's this person. This person has a condition that's making them behave this way. But I don't like using the word because I feel like it takes accountability away from the person. Like, this person gets to make choices, and they don't have to hurt you. You know what I mean?
Oh, it takes accountability from which person away? The
From the
perpetrator?
perpetrator. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Because it's saying like, oh, this person can't help that they act this way. It's like
You're right. And
it's a personality disorder.
right. And that's absolutely not what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm so
yeah.
glad
Just like that's when I hear the word narcissist, like, that's where my head goes.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. You know what? You're right. And I'm so glad you brought that up because, a person who's suicidal or depressed or whatever, sorry, those are mood disorders and those are conditions. But
right.
personality disorders, I mean, there is, some researchers and some people on the ground, like therapists and clinicians say, like, narcissism cannot be cured. It's a lifelong disease.
Right.
Um,
Right.
however, you know, I think that you're right in that we can't use it as an excuse to exclude
Right.
people, right? I think more so what's important is to recognize that these are the qualities, these are the traits, and if this person has them, then how can I work on establishing my own boundaries? And how can I
Right.
work on detaching and getting away from the codependency?
Yeah.
Because those relationships often are extremely codependent. And so
Yeah.
one person's livelihood is extremely connected to the other person's livelihood. Essentially, like, one person is the master and the other person is the slave. And that's usually
Right.
the power dynamic. I agree with you that on the ground, I've also noticed that the term narcissism is kind of pretty liberally used.
Yeah.
And that's why
Yeah.
I'm very careful about distinguishing between the actual personality disorder and then
Right.
traits that kind of appear in the
Right.
community. These are just elements of the disorder, but that doesn't
Right.
mean someone full on meets the diagnostic criteria or whatever it is.
Right. Awesome. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. I just always ask folks, like, when they use the word, like, what do you mean by that? So I can have a better understanding. But as far as like those traits being very present in the community, I can definitely see that. And I think it just comes down to like the way that I see it, I guess, is that like our community, like, overall, at least in my experience, the way that I see the community and like the way that Islam was taught to me and the things that I was taught to focus on were very much like very black and white, rule based, like
Yes.
ritual, like, right, like that's kind of what I was taught, and that's what we were taught to focus on. But if you look at the at faith, like if you look at Islam, there is a lot of emphasis on character development, right? And like taking a step back and reflecting on your patterns and your habits and working on yourself. And that is so neglected. And so what ends up happening is that people think, because of the way they're taught, because of the message that's reiterated in the community again and again and again, if I'm praying 5 times a day, if I'm doing these ritual practices, I'm good. I'm a good person, even if I'm treating people like trash. Okay. And I'm like, no, let's take a step back. Let's just wind back here. The way that you make other people feel is very, very important, right? And that it's going to involve how you work on yourself, like how you view yourself and how you work on yourself. And there's just a disturbing lack of that in the community. So you get all these unhealed folks that don't have a lot of self-awareness, folks that aren't working on themselves because they were kind of taught not to, folks that are like saying like, well, I'm praying and I'm doing X, Y, and Z, so thereby I am a good person. And then and they're not working on themselves, so they end up hurting people, right? And we're all capable of harm. All we can do is like stop and take a step back and try to work on ourselves to reduce the harm that we cause other people. But people aren't doing that in the community, and it's leading, and when it's leaders and when it's like elders and when it's, you know, folks that have power, it ends up causing a lot of spiritual trauma in people that aren't fitting into the Muslim box per se, right? Like the very specific defined thing that you need to be accepted by the community and get support.
Yes, and I think your point is so, like, it's so perfect and accurate, because in terms of what represents Muslimness and Islamic behaviors is the emphasis on ritual practices, right? So people are observing if you're praying, people are observing if you're fasting, people are observing if you wear something that indicates you're visibly Muslim, right? These are the behaviors that are associated with the construct of Muslim in, I think, in this country, but also in other countries too. And I think to kind of step back a little bit and evaluate your point that you made around people are unhealed, and so they use some of these ritual practices or whatever. What are they unhealed from? You know, I truly think there's a huge endemic, and that means that's an epidemic that's been ongoing for a number of years. There's a huge endemic of childhood trauma in the Muslim community. And I mean, in general too, right? So, I mean, more than 60% of Americans have actually had at least one incident of childhood trauma in their life. And what we're defining as childhood trauma is generally accepted as, you know, something ranging from you could actually have a parent with a mental illness to you were physically, verbally, sexually, emotionally, psychologically abused as a kid, to maybe one of your parents was incarcerated, to being exposed to domestic violence. And I mean, just on that alone, like just on those 4 alone, because I believe there's like 10, and in some other measures, there's like more than 10. And a lot of these are not culturally validated, especially for the Muslim community. And that's what I'm hoping that inshallah one day I can also focus on. But in terms of childhood trauma, I mean, first of all, think about who we are. Let's take a step back. Who are we? We're in the United States, almost 80% of us are first or second generation immigrants. So we're coming from 77 different countries, all of whom have their own cultural practices, right? And are also, most of the Muslim world is extremely oppressed. We're oppressed economically, we're oppressed from civil rights. You know, we have so much oppression going on, and that level of structural violence or structural oppression ends up going through from like the policies to, you know, the national policies to down to the community level, down to the family level, and ultimately the individual. And that violence that's in the social atmosphere becomes internalized as self-directed violence, which is suicide. That's the definition of suicide, is self-directed violence. And when we talk about people walking around unhealed, I'm thinking, like, I actually met this guy, okay? I was like trying to plan, I was invited to be a camp counselor with this Muslim org out here in Maryland. And I met this person, and I was like, you know, this person was very attackful toward me and abusive. And I was interacting with him, and the more, like, I was very gentle and kind, and the more I kept talking to him, because he's like a leader in the community, the more I realized, like, oh my God, I think he's been through some childhood trauma that's been unresolved. And when I saw it in him, I began seeing it in all the other people. And I was like, oh my God, this is like
Yeah.
eye-opening, because now when I go into Muslim spaces, I actually actively recognize that almost as an assumption.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
changed radically how I interact with the Muslim community.
Yeah. No, it does. Because you can have more grace. You can have more grace for people once you understand that. Once you understand that everyone is walking with their own experience, their own trauma, as well as like generations of trauma, right? That has not been resolved. And I'm sure you've experienced this too. Like when I interact with like the elders in my family, right? When I interact with my parents, when I aunts, uncles, um, in my own healing, I've had to accept that they can only meet me so far because they haven't done a lot of their own healing, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's been like a really revolutionary part of my healing, because I've changed my expectations
Same here.
from around them. Because I know I was like, I've very actively worked on addressing these things. They haven't had the chance or the opportunity to. And so I can have more grace, right? When I interact with them. But I think also, like, just in general, there's so many people who just have not faced these really heavy things in their lives. And as a result, they end up hurting other people. And it's not intentional, right? Like they don't even realize it. But that doesn't mean that they don't, that there's no accountability there. Like you're an adult, you can take a step back and like reflect on yourself. And I think as long as I'm seeing that effort, right, I'm pretty content with people. But when I'm not seeing that effort at all, when I'm not seeing any acknowledgement of it, right, that's when I'm like, okay.
And that's where, let me tell you, that's honestly, that particular scenario that you just described is what I was referring to when I referred to narcissistic traits.
Yeah.
Because and not that narcissism explains all of that, I'm not saying that either, but I'm saying that if we have an underlying assumption that this type of behavior is normalized, right? Because we very well know, okay, look, I think we can establish for a fact that you and I have noticed several Muslim leaders that are prominent figures who probably suffer from narcissistic personality disorder. And that, because they are in the limelight, that is considered normal behavior. And so people use that as a reference point and can internalize some of those behaviors. And although they may themselves not have narcissism, they may exhibit those behaviors and traits. And the disease itself is deeply rooted in childhood trauma.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And oh my God, that's such a good point, Amelia, because I have been talking about this with like my friends and within my circle so much lately is the fact that we as a community pardon very problematic behavior, right, from leaders, like abuse and things like that. And I keep telling them, I was like, if we pardon it at that level, we're going to pardon it at other levels. And this is what's leading to a lot of, or it's contributing to intimate partner violence and domestic violence in our communities, and folks just accepting it, like being like, you know what, well, this is normal, right? Because our leaders behave this way. So if my partner is behaving this way, you know, that's just how it is. That's just how life is. Exactly. Like I can't, you know what I mean? And not even knowing what healthy is. So we need to do a lot of education around what abuse looks like, what it feels like, right? What's acceptable, what's not, what's healthy, what does healthy look like, right?
We know what healthy looks like.
Yeah, people don't, because again, we keep pardoning problematic behavior from leadership.
Okay, let me ask you something, and because this is completely off the cuff, please forgive us if something about this doesn't resonate with you. I do have to ask you, and I'm very curious to hear, what is your take on Usama Canon's death? Like, how people have received it, how people have responded to it? Because for those who don't know, Usama Canon was a major religious figure who started the Tatlif Collective, out in the Bay Area, who was very, very influential in bringing a lot of young Muslims back to Islam and creating and fostering what we thought was a safe space for kind of exploring our identities. However, we did find out later on that he had engaged in several acts of sexual violence against women. And Areeba, I also want to be very sensitive about if this is triggering for you, and if you don't want to go this, we don't have to talk about this at all. But I did want to ask, like, if you are comfortable responding, what you thought about how we as a community have handled his death.
Okay.
So are you comfortable, first of all?
Yes, yeah. I'll try my best to express like my complex feelings around it, because it's definitely very layered.
It's huge.
It's so huge. So I will say, like, I am a survivor. So the way that I look at these things is very much like in a more survivor-centered way.
Yes. Exactly.
I do know that a lot of folks really benefited from the things that he taught, and probably even experienced some spiritual healing in the things that he taught.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe maybe can't even hold that he perpetrated these things. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't even have full knowledge of exactly what happened.
I don't either. I remember trying to read something, and I can't handle it. I really can't.
I don't think I was in the space to either.
Don't.
As far as the community response, I just wish that there had been more acknowledgement.
That's exactly the same thing.
And you can hold like this person benefited me in a lot of ways, and also I acknowledge that he caused harm. Like, those two things can be held together. You can acknowledge that someone caused harm, right? And also still acknowledge that they did good things, because that's all of us. Like, we all do good things and harm people, right? So I think I just wish that there had been more acknowledgement. And honestly, like, it didn't register. Like, when I heard of his death, I did not, like, again, I had not read up a lot about the abuse that he perpetrated, so it didn't register fully. And I just remember seeing people mourning his death. And then I saw like one person post about how that could be impacting survivors. And then I was like, wait, okay, I need to go back and like review the complexity here around this person. And I had a couple conversations with close friends, and they were also like, oh, like there were all these scandals, and, or, you know, X, Y, and Z occurred. And I was like, oh, okay. And now when I look back, I just wish that there had been more acknowledgement. Like, I understand that a lot of folks have benefited from him. I just wish that they could also acknowledge that his death also brings up a lot of pain for survivors.
Absolutely. And you know what, Areeba, like, so let me also bring this. I actually lived in the Bay Area, and I used to go to Tetlif, and my husband and I, when we first got married, we spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, and we went to Tetlif together. And you know, Usama Canon knew us, and you know, we spent time in Tetlif and all that. I loved the guy. But then when I found out that he had done all these things, to me it was just like another, like, just let down. Like, when can we believe in someone? And you know, when his death was posted, and I thought, Imam, they'd Shocker post about it, you know, I saw that very carefully crafted message around his death that I could almost actually feel a sense of heaviness in Zaid Shocker's him. And I could also sense that I think he felt a lot for the women and all the victims that were and survivors, obviously victim survivors of that violence. But missing was the narrative about his actions that were there that have created a dual legacy, a legacy that has definitely fostered safe, you know, not safe spaces, but and a place for people to explore Muslim American identity, but then also a legacy that has fostered the normalization of sexual violence and the excusing of sexual violence, and you know, lack of acknowledgement, and essentially gaslighting of sexual violence of what this legacy of this man is. And you know, I read in some other posts, I don't remember what it was, but I read in some other posts that, you know, in the Islamic tradition, you're not supposed to bring up the negative things that this person has done in their life when you're talking about their death. And I was like, okay, I acknowledge that. But, you know, not everyone is a saint. Like, people have, if there is ongoing trauma that has resulted from someone's life actions, that must be provided as a resource. So for example, like I had tagged Faith in one of my comments that I had put on a community member's Facebook page, because I was saying like she, you know, she had this eulogy for him. And it was funny because like she had a very, very, very artistic, beautiful picture of him. And I got triggered. And I was like, oh my God, we are, what's the word when you like make someone portray really well?
I don't know, sensationalizing, like, or like maybe sensationalizing is the right word. I guess just putting them on a pedestal. Or like,
yeah, putting them on a pedestal. We're like putting him on a pedestal, and then like there's this image of who he is that's going to be the memory of who he is, right? And it's like this really hipstery, cool, like artistic picture. And you know, he had a really distinct style, which I think allowed a lot of us to a freedom of expression and how we expressed ourselves as Muslims. But that, you know, that also has to be contextualized, because what he stood for was not just one thing. He had that dual legacy. And I think,
yeah,
so at least in the eulogies, go ahead and say all the great things about him. But after the eulogies, put the numbers for the domestic violence hotline.
yeah, just acknowledge the complexity, like you can honor the person, but just acknowledge, like we also acknowledge, at least in these more like official press releases type thing, like if someone is posting their own thoughts and feelings, everyone's going to grieve differently. There could even be survivors that benefited a lot, right, from him and spiritually, and maybe they're not even ready to acknowledge that harm yet, right? Because everyone's going to be in a different place. And so if they want to celebrate him right now, that's fine. Later they might want to acknowledge that. Everyone's process is going to be different. But I think in these more like official like press release type things, or like leadership talking about him, I think at the very least there should just be acknowledgement, like we also understand that this can be bringing up very
Exactly.
complex feelings for folks, and here are resources to help you process those feelings.
Exactly.
Right. Hard to actually posted a wonderful thing. I'm always going to be I just love the work that they do, right? They post something about like those who do good can also cause harm, and just acknowledging the complexity, and I really appreciated that, because we're all complex. And if someone is having a hard time acknowledging a part of a person, that sometimes it's reflective that they haven't fully embraced and accepted themselves wholly. So then they have a hard time wholly embracing someone else. Right. So there's just so many layers to it. But I think, yeah. And everyone, again, everyone's going to grieve differently. Everyone might be focusing on a different piece of who he was right now. That's okay. I just think that in the official statements, there should be some kind of acknowledgement and resources listed, right?
I agree 100%. Because you know what to me this symbolized or represent for the Muslim community was a missed opportunity, right?
Yeah.
This is a time when we have a major American Muslim religious and faith leader who's held a very, very critical, paramount position, and was actually not just located in California, but he had a site in, I think, Chicago, right, or in the Midwest. And so this was like spanning the country. And we could have taken it as an opportunity, because you know what? We shouldn't wait until someone dies to acknowledge that harm. And what we're essentially communicating to the community is that, oh, you can live a life and you can have all this sexual violence, and then you can die and no one's going to do anything about it.
And that's actually, I also, Amelia, like how this can be tied back to suicide, right? Is like when, and I'm a survivor. So when I see people not acknowledge the harm that a leader caused and only focus on the good, like I feel isolated. Like I feel like, my emotions and my healing don't matter, right? I feel that way. I'm just trying my best to acknowledge that there is complexity and people grieve differently. And I don't know everything, right? I'm just speaking from my perspective. Like, I think that I feel hurt. And like, there could be a lot of survivors who read messages about him who are feeling very hurt and isolated right now. And this is one of the ways that sometimes our community isolates people and leads to, right, that isolation and the lack of acknowledgement can, lack of acknowledgement of pain can lead to people feeling, you know, increased suicidality, increased depression, like
Yeah.
they don't belong in the community.
Yes.
And so I just, yeah, going back to it, like there needs to be at the very least some acknowledgement, because even if I read something where at the end they wrote all these good things and then at the end wrote, we also acknowledge that he has hurt and caused harm, and for those who are feeling those emotions or feeling triggered, here are resources, I would feel seen. I would just feel like, oh, thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that. Thanks for once again not just
validated as
yeah,
opposed to invalidated. You
yeah,
would feel seen as opposed to gaslighted, right?
yeah,
So, and this is the problem. There's so many male patriarchal gatekeepers of these, and they're like, it's almost as if they're tag teaming without even realizing it, and sometimes with realizing it. So some of it is unintentional and subconscious, and then others of it is very
intentional. Yeah, some of it is just I mean, some of it is male privilege, some of it is like not, or not even male privilege, like just not being a survivor privilege, right? Because there could be women that are also like upholding the same thing.
Absolutely.
I just keep going back to the complexity.
Validation. What?
I just keep going back to the complexity around, like, and as far as this topic goes, Usama Canon's death, like when we are interacting with people grieving, I think we should give folks space to grieve however works for them and not push that they should be feeling a certain way. But I'm just saying again, in like these more public statements, there needs to be at the very least some acknowledgement, because that little acknowledgement can go a really long way and can in fact be kind of healing for a lot of survivors.
Absolutely, because that's, like I said, that vicarious healing thing of, okay, if I experience trauma in a community setting, then the healing can also happen in a community setting.
Yeah.
You know, and we talk a lot about also like the connections between grooming and violence. You know, the community has been groomed by people like this, right? So it's not just that person or that individual has groomed a particular woman or groomed a particular person to perform, you know, these acts. But the community has also been groomed to understand that as, oh, well, you know what, this is a good person, so even if he did so and so, he's just a human. And that messaging is very, very, very damaging and has very subtle, but in my opinion, overt tones of normalizing violence, and also extremely symbolic violence. So that's the concept of, you know, you can't achieve your self-actualization because of the existing structures that occur around you. The patriarchy, the sexism, the racism, the Islamophobia, it prevents you from fully being seen and heard. And so your self-esteem is always at this lower level because you're chronically invalidated. You don't see hope. You don't see the hope of you ever being seen. You don't see the hope of you of anything ever changing, because you know how deeply rooted these
things are. Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
So then you become depressed, hopeless, suicidal. You become anxious. You feel alone. You feel like you're the only one. You feel like something's wrong with you. You feel like, why is everyone attacking me? I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. You know, you become in this really like low place where you're like, oh my God, like if I say anything, it's just going to lower my value even more. So why would I say anything?
Yeah. And this is why, like, as a community, like we should be holding folks accountable when they cause harm, like especially in leadership positions. Of course, with Usama Canon, the situation that's different right now is he just passed, right? So it's not something where we can hold him accountable right now per se, right? And just that acknowledgement would have gone such a long way. But in cases where we're seeing someone actively harming and abusing and it comes to light, we need to hold them accountable, right?
Who's we? Who is the we? Because let's talk about your point that you wanted to talk about community and
Yes.
community care. So
Yeah.
what does community care look like? Because this is something that you're really big on. So tell me a little bit about that, and like we can tie it into this conversation or we can move whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think just the Muslim community as a collective, like we all have responsibility here, right? We all have some level of responsibility. I will say, like, it just really sucks that at least when it comes to sexual violence and domestic violence and intimate partner violence, that the onus of holding the perpetrator accountable is always falling on the victim, right? I think the community needs to play, as a whole, needs to play a stronger role in holding folks that are actively abusing and harming accountable, and take the onus off of the, like, off the victim a little bit, right? And I understand it's complex. I understand we're all human. I understand that we all can do good and do harm, right? And this person is unhealed to an extent, and that's why this harm is occurring.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean we can't hold them accountable, right? Like they should still be held accountable. And it really, I was just talking to a friend about this last night. Like, it really is so upsetting and hurtful when abuse from a leadership comes to light, and they don't take accountability for it. They don't acknowledge it. They don't do nothing, and they just continue go about like preaching, and people still listen to them and give them all this credibility. That blows my mind.
Would you say that part of it is like desensitization too?
Definitely. And privilege, frankly, because in order to still engage with someone that's caused harm like that, you are not a survivor, right? You haven't been hurt in that way, or you're like super in denial of harm that you've experienced.
These same people have daughters.
Yeah. But they're not, I mean, I've had debates with my own like family about some of these leaders, right?
Yeah.
And I know for a fact that in my family, folks that are like siding with these leaders have also experienced sexual violence, but they have not acknowledged it yet. Or they've like really buried it.
That's the thing. They've buried it. And so bringing it up is actually a trigger for them. But instead of recognizing that as a trigger, they avoid it and they live in a delusional kind of world where their version of reality makes them feel safe, which is fine. That's their coping mechanism. They're avoidant copers. And they would rather live in that safe space where that didn't happen to them. But what they're not recognizing is because they haven't taken the time or energy to heal themselves, they're actually engaging in harming others.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the issue. And I think, like we keep saying in the community, this is what's happening as a whole. I feel like if everyone took a step back and like acknowledged their pain and worked on their own healing, the community would be a much more welcoming and inclusive space. But people aren't doing that, right? Yeah. And that's why all this harm is happening, and in turn, like spiritual trauma is occurring. And there's all these layers of guilt and shame and like that are like playing into it. So even when I've talked to some of my, like, I have a stellar support system. Like I feel very lucky for the community that I have. But even then, sometimes like I will be explaining like, you know what, I'm not ready to like partake in this ritual or do this or do that, right? And I'll explain like, I acknowledge some of this is my own trauma lens. I acknowledge like I'm just not ready right now. And I'll still get this like, but this is what you should be doing, right? And I think it's just a lack of, and sometimes like I think I know them well enough. I know that they're well-intentioned. I know they're not trying to hurt me, right? So I just have grace in the moment and just acknowledge like they don't understand, right? Like my experience. And I can do that because I've also worked on my healing to a certain extent. But I think if I was earlier in my trauma and I hadn't done the healing, that interaction could lead me to not trusting these parts of my support system, right? So I think as a community, as humans, just even outside the Muslim community, the way that we carry ourselves, like it should almost just be with the assumption that people have pain, right? And like we're going to interact to the best of our ability in a way that will nurture someone carrying pain, right? And the Muslim community is just not doing that.
And I think part of the reason why is that we don't have the formula to get there. And a huge part of the formula is actually trusting each other. And
huh? No, and just internal work. Like
internal work, yes.
Yeah.
In order to do that internal work, you have to have a safe space. You cannot have a safe space. You cannot heal on your own. Number one, I do sometimes take issue with the assumption that people are their own agents of healing, because healing doesn't happen in a vacuum. Healing has to happen to some degree in a group setting too. Like because you're a social being, your healing will also be social in nature. So there is some individual aspect to it, but there's also environmental aspects to it. And part of that environmental aspect is having a safe space. And in order to have a safe space, one of the key ingredients is having trust. That, you know, you can trust that people here are not going to attack you, are not going to judge you, are not going to shame you. And when you have a space where you feel safe, then it can allow you to look inward, I think, and acknowledge that, you know, if people here who will love you no matter what, who will accept you no matter what, you will belong here no matter what.
Right.
Then you can start to acknowledge the demons that have been living inside of you, quite literally the demons. And I do very specifically use that word because in the Islamic belief, you know, we believe in metaphysical existence. We believe in shaitan. We believe in the devil, right? We believe in evil happening. And these traumas are evil. Oppression is evil. You know, the pride in oneself, the arrogance is quite literally the difference between shaitan and the first human being ever created, right? Like literally arrogance and pride that I'm not going to bow to the creator. That's evil, people.
And so, that's such a good point, because obviously this like internal work and healing requires humility, right? The opposite of arrogance. I always focus on this. Like, even if you don't understand something, just lead with humility, right? Even if you don't fully understand where the other person's coming from, you fully don't understand their pain or their trauma, you don't have all that insight. If you just lead with humility, like, you know what I mean? And lead with a genuine and sincere intention to benefit people around you to the best of your ability, like that in itself is enough. Right?
I think people know what humility actually looks like, and that's part of why I mentioned the concept of narcissism. And I know I'm bringing this up a lot, but there are ties here that me, like, because you know, as a researcher, I see the broader perspective. I see the broader things and how they connect. So humility is not a characteristic of anyone who's in a narcissistic environment. Right. So humility is something that is sometimes seen as a weakness, because humility in some people's understanding would mean you have to acknowledge wrong, acknowledge harm. And when you acknowledge that, it portrays you as you made a mistake. So therefore you're not a perfect person. And therefore you're not worthy of attention. You're not worthy of love. You're not worthy of whatever it is. So there's like a very kind of like step one, step two kind of trail leading back to a sense of entitlement and a sense of not lack of compassion, lack of empathy. And I think that ultimately how people define humility and what humility actually looks like is totally askew in the Muslim community. Like to me, from my personal experience living in the Muslim community, what humility looks like is the doctor in the community who makes like 400 grand pretends that, you know, he's not a doctor and doesn't want to show off to everyone. And, you know, even though he drives his like super expensive Infinity car, whatever it is, or Mercedes or BMW, whatever it is, he drives that and everyone knows he's donating to the masjid, they're donating to the Islamic school. And then everyone's just like, oh, he's so humble. Oh, look at him. Nice man. Look at, he actually sees us. He sets the mask. You know, like
So what
that's
I'm hearing is it's just very performative. Yeah.
performative. That's the perfect word. It's very performative, and people
Yeah.
don't think people actually, especially not to paint a broad stroke of the men, but the male leaders that I personally have experienced, and this is almost like a common given trait, is like they just don't actually know what humility looks like.
Yeah. I mean, because humility really, I guess the way that I would define it, or I guess humility requires that you accept your own humanity, right? Like,
Exactly. Subhanallah. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Yes.
yeah. If you can accept your own humanity, you can accept other people's humanity.
That's the thing. We're so oppressed and so dehumanized. We've internalized that.
Yeah.
I love that you bring it back to that, because that's something I'm personally huge on. I'm always talking about how dehumanized I feel in Muslim spaces, and that it's just a reflection of how dehumanized we are as a collective ummah. You know, like we're being bombed. You know, like we don't even have to be in a war on terror for people to feel the effects of imperialism, right? That violence translates to suicide
Mhm.
generation after generation. That violence, that culture of war is telling people that they're not worthy, and that gets internalized, and then you have second generation immigrants are at risk of suicide more than any other generation, not first generation, not third generation. So it's not your parents who become suicidal when they come here, it's their kids like us who are born here, raised here. And I don't remember quite where I was going with this, but I think the idea just that in terms of understanding humility and understanding, you know, what we're made of, like that in and of itself is something that we should be embodying and should have a model for. Because I mean, and there have been really effective leaders like Usama Canon, who I think displayed some version of what humility should look like. But even then, we were deceived, because at the end of the day, he was a hypocrite. So like where, like, you know, where can we find an understanding of humility? I mean, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I mean, the man was born as someone who was adopted, someone who was illiterate, you know, someone who was at 40 years old tasked with the extremely heavy task of leading an entire faith group, an entire ummah and empire. And people forget to acknowledge their own pasts, their own backgrounds and upbringings. Why do you think I'm so open about being a survivor of suicide? Why do you think I'm so open about going to McDonald's and drinking, you know, buying McDonald's, even though I'm this PhD at Hopkins and,
Mhm.
you know, like all these fancy things? Because, you know, at the end of the day, I'm a human being who's made of dirt, just like anybody else. And Allah doesn't see these positions, Allah doesn't see these titles. And I think that if we were to look at what behaviors ground us, because I think that's what it is ultimately, is a lack of grounding.
Mhm.
People don't know how to ground themselves, so they're off in this la la land of like their self-image of like, oh well, I'm perceived as so and so person, I'm perceived as this powerful, I'm perceived as that. So there's like a built-in assumption, there's a built-in mechanism for them to constantly have to fulfill that image, like, oh,
Mhm.
I have to show people that I can do this, I have to show people that I can buy this, I have to show people that I volunteered here, because that's going to feed into my image. And ultimately, people are up here in their head and just constantly thinking about their head, not paying attention to their heart, to their soul. What makes, I mean, when's the last time anyone actually took off their shoes and felt the grass on earth and quite literally grounded themselves? And
Mhm.
there's not research yet, I don't think there's research on this, but I read about the benefits of touching your feet on the ground, because there's minerals and vitamins in that soil that get absorbed through the, you know, epidermis, your skin.
Mhm.
And that also, those are the key elements like zinc, nitrogen, calcium, oxygen, you know, hydrogen. Those are those key elements that refuel us and literally keep us grounded. I mean, why are we told to focus on breathing and have breathing exercises? People lose their breath. They don't have grounding. They're caught up in this other world, this other realm of reality of who they are. And they actually, I think, believe that other people see them like that. And it's this perception that it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's so, I feel like there's so many angles and layers with which we can look at this. But yeah, there is. It's again, like the way that our community is set up is very performative. It's very, and again, it just goes back to like the emphasis is just on like these ritual things and like these very like performative things. I guess they don't have to be performative. Like people can be doing these things with sincerity, but there is just this like, yeah, the emphasis is just on this image.
Mm-hmm.
And the community is not embracing the wholeness of a person. It's embracing parts of a person. So what ends up happening is people end up performing out of a need to survive, right? Because they want to be accepted by the community.
Exactly.
And that performance is what can breed hypocrisy.
Exactly.
If there was a space that just fully embraced the humanness of a person, which requires folks that like embrace their own humanity to be in leadership, right? Like, and that's what we don't have. Like, generally speaking.
Like, what would these imams became poor?
I mean, I feel like many of them are. They're not paid very, I feel like they're not paid very well. I mean,
Good point. Good point. I mean,
yeah.
celebrity imams, like celebrities to you, celebrity imams. You know, like these people who, yeah, maybe they actually probably are poor, and then they don't admit it, and they don't seek community help, that the community care could actually be happening, but they don't acknowledge their own humanity. They don't acknowledge that, you know, I am so and so, because they want to be perceived as powerful people.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. I will say, like, I can think of a couple of imams that I've had interactions with that I feel like really did have like the humility. Like I could see it. I could see it. But I think what was there is that there was a lot of sincerity and service. Like I could tell that for them, leadership was servitude, not holding on to a position or power. Like, and there is an acknowledgement of their own shortcomings, right? Like in terms of like character and what they're doing and what they're struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
And just in the way that they're talking, right? Like I can just tell in my interaction with them that they do embrace the wholeness of themselves as a person. Like they acknowledge like I have shortcomings, I have positive traits. And I just see it in the way that they're interacting with people. I mean, you can tell when someone's doing things to hold on to power and like an image, and when someone's doing something because they genuinely want to serve like the people around them. So I just, yeah, but I will say that it does feel like the overwhelming majority do not do that. Like I have to think, and I can think of two, like two imams that I've had like those positive interactions with, and I really appreciate them. And one of them's like is not currently even serving as an imam, took a step back. And the other one, like he's the only imam that currently like I feel comfortable being in spaces with currently, and has been very healing for me. And it's because he has acknowledged his own humanity.
I have to tell you the same thing. I can only think of one.
Yeah.
And I've lived in many places. I've lived in Los Angeles, Orange County, Bay Area, California, New York, St. Louis, Baltimore. Now I'm in Columbia, Maryland. And then I spent a considerable amount of time in the suburbs of Cincinnati, where I have family, you know, and it's so hard to think. And you know what, like, yeah, what does a positive imam or sheikh look like? Well, I'll tell you one thing. The sheikh I'm thinking of is married to someone who's also a sheikha. And the humility, what that looks like is detaching from the material world. I mean, that's the first step, right? I noticed that they were very open about like not having fancy cars. And mind you, this isn't a community that was extremely wealthy, okay? Irvine, California, extremely wealthy community, and extremely image-based. I mean, you know, like people in Irvine know what I'm talking about, so I'm not bad-mouthing anyone. It's just kind of like an accepted fact. I mean, SoCal in general. And, you know, what they stood for was just so inspiring. And ironically enough, I don't know why it is, but like them just being authentic to themselves, authentically human and flawed, and you know, and being open about and vulnerable about the fact that they're not perfect,
Mm,
and that they themselves are still learning the deen and still learning how to practice it, right? I mean, for whatever reason, that doesn't appeal to people.
yeah.
Almost, it's like almost as if we've been conditioned to only be attracted to these like abusive dynamics, right? Like it's very like it's like the same thing like when women who've been abused in the past get attracted to men or other partners who are also abusive to them.
Right.
It's like that same concept, but like at a community level.
Yeah, it's going back to that lack of healing and lack of acknowledgement of pain, and like kind of doing that out of a need to survive. So I
Yeah.
mean, it's they're just such these like systemic issues that really start with the individual person. Like again, if every individual person actively worked on acknowledging their pain and like right working on their own healing, then we as the community could be a more collective space. Obviously that's like a dream that's far away. So like where would we start? I think it would be in setting that example of taking accountability for yourself and working on yourself, and having folks like openly sharing their narratives of like acknowledging their pain and healing, um and you know those folks trying or like being in more leadership positions, and a part of that is also holding leaders who harm accountable, and I think just yeah, like these are I think the broad strokes things that I'm thinking of right now. And I think what you're saying, like creating trust and creating spaces that feel safe where folks can fully be themselves, but I just feel like
Hmm.
at least informally in like Muslim settings, like it's hard to do.
Yes, it is.
It's
And
hard
I
to do.
was gonna say one point on that. I think part of the reason why it's hard to do is there's a lot of rejection sensitivity
Yeah.
in the Muslim community. And there is like in the DSM, which I recently found out, apparently there's something called rejection sensitive dysphoria. So there's like literally a condition for this where some people are afflicted with such deep sense of feeling rejected and fear of being rejected that they can actually become reclusive and isolated and suicidal. And I personally dealt with a lot of rejection sensitivity. I dealt, and by the way, it's also one of the key elements in ADHD that I have been finding out that I possibly have myself. And there's a whole long story about that, but rejection sensitivity. I mean, I felt constantly rejected because I was stigmatized. I mean, I'm a poor, dark brown girl with a mom who's an immigrant and single in the Muslim community. And growing up, I was passed around to so many aunties in the community who knew our story, like who knew that my dad was mentally ill and had mental illness and would become violent. I mean, I grew up, I haven't shared this with people, but I think this would be an apt time to share it. I grew up with my dad. First of all, he was out of our lives. Um, since I was 1 years old. And then when I was 9, he came back into our lives. And I remember when he came back, he was, you know, stuff was not turning the right directions in his head. And I believe he has paranoid schizophrenia. So he has delusions, he has hallucinations, he's, you know, thinks the government is watching him, which is he wrong? No.
Yeah.
um,
Rooted in some reality there.
really is. And you know what? And I have a whole bunch of stuff that I can talk about schizophrenia, inshallah, some other time.
Yeah.
But I grew up with him being so paranoid that he would put knives on the floor of the balcony patio doors.
Oh wow.
And I don't know why he would do that, but he would just place them there. And if you didn't see them, you could have gotten hurt. And so
Yeah.
it's just like constant in his head, just constantly like afraid of being attacked. And just that mental image alone, like I've mentioned it in therapy and like I don't have full resolution over it. Ironically, I grew up with my mom using a knife, putting it on a stove and heating it up and burning my face when she got a report card from school from my pharma school saying that I talked too much in class. And that was actually the one moment when my therapist was like, oppression, 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 oppression. Like she has been taught to brand you like a slave, like in our South Asian tradition. The concept of slavery, right? And even like having like a house servant is so normalized, you know, and the way you treat that house servant is very similar to how masters treated their slaves. So I mean, in terms of these very painful memories, right? Like coming back, I almost don't even remember. Oh, we were talking about rejection sensitivity. Just that, you know, from a very early age, I was stigmatized because I had a single mom. I had a dad with a serious mental illness. And I grew up poor and ashamed of myself, really ashamed of myself. I had some impulsive behaviors as a kid that were public, and people knew that I had these impulsive behaviors, and so they passed a lot of judgment around who I am, and you know, I grew up with a lot of shame, internalized shame, a lot of shame, um different layers of shame. I mean, like every kind of like major trauma, you know, I have somewhere in my family existence. You know, every kind of major trauma, including like migration trauma, and like I lost an aunt to the partition, who I never met. Like, you know, I have, you know, aunts and uncles who are pretty old, and I have, you know, aunts and uncles that are pretty young. And, you know, I just remind myself as a survivor, I ground myself, and I don't allow an opportunity to pass without acknowledging my own humanity and showing other people of my humanity. And I have one thing to share. This is my ring
Mhm.
that represents that I'm a survivor of a suicide attempt, and it's green, and it's not emerald, but it's some stone. It's not that expensive. It's like, I'm not gonna share the price, but it was in the hundreds. And alhamdulillah, like I got this ring on my 30th birthday because my entire life I lived assuming with deep suicidality since I was I think youngin. Um, I assumed I wasn't gonna make it to my 30th birthday.
Mm.
And so when I wear this, I literally can ground myself. I mean, I'm looking at my favorite color, emerald green, and green is the color of life. And life is to be lived, and it's unnatural to kill yourself. It's not something that's a normal behavior. And it's beautiful, and I get to remind myself all the time when I'm wearing it, like, you're a survivor, girl. Yeah, girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, girl. Doing PhD. Yeah, girl. Yeah.
You should. Wow. Okay. First of all, I'm so sorry that like those were the experiences that you had growing up, and I'm honored that you've just shared that here. Um, and yeah, I love that you bought this ring for yourself. That's so symbolic. I love that it's green. I just love the color green, and I love the association with with life and living and the natural world.
Favorite color.
So what a thoughtful way of celebrating yourself. I really, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Yeah. Um, and I love just the meaning of it on your 30th birthday. I just, wow, what an act of self-love. You put a lot of thought into that, you know, and I think that's what like loving yourself really looks like, right? Putting the amount of thoughtfulness that we're conditioned to put into other people, into yourself.
Absolutely. And liberating yourself of that shame.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Being
beautiful.
a survivor for me is beautiful. It's honestly the last element of my healing journey that I was like, you know, I'm ashamed of all these things, but as soon as I come out in the open about this, I will be less ashamed. I have
Great.
a neighbor, by the way, who's a psychotherapist, this white woman who's a psychotherapist, and is openly, you know, openly says that she was formerly an addict and struggled with addiction. And I'm like, wow, like people like this exist that just like out in the open about all this stuff. And
Yeah.
I was like, wow. And then you know what she said? That um the things you're ashamed of happen in the shadows, in the dark. And so in order to get away from those addictive behaviors that are rooted in your trauma, you need to get out of that darkness. You need to get out of the shadows and start doing behaviors that are in the light, and things that you're not ashamed of, because that's going to ultimately contribute to your healing.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's so powerful. I think in sharing our narratives openly, it can be a reflection of fully embracing your own humanity, right? Like it just goes back to that, saying like, yes, this was my experience. Like I'm not going to hide it because that's what it is, right? And this is how I responded, and this is how I worked on it, or this is how it's impacted me. That is an acknowledgement of healing, right? Specifically talking about like the impacts and the healing. I mean, yeah, it's humility. It's humility, sharing those experiences, being transparent about how it has hurt you, being transparent about how maybe you have hurt people as a result of
Yes.
this trauma before you started working on your healing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think there's so much beauty in it. And yeah, and I think like sharing these narratives and having more transparency is what can help build trust in communities, and in turn lead to more folks working on themselves, and in turn lead to just more like a more healing and open space for all Muslims, instead of like a space that can offer more unconditional love. Like right now, I think the community care that is available to Muslims within the Muslim community is very conditional because
hold on, because you just took away my thesis. That is actually the thing that I talk about all the time. In fact, you can talk to all the people I always talk to, because that's what I always say. I believe in radical, unconditional love and support.
Yeah.
And I actually had a conversation. This and do you want to end after this? Do you want to continue, since we've been going for a while?
Oh my God. Yeah. We're like more than the 2-hour mark here, huh?
Yeah.
I think this feels like a good ending point, right? The cure for the isolation and the increased suicidality is more transparency, more openness, more kindness, more folks then, which can help people heal, which can create a space that actually offers unconditional love.
Yes, exactly. Because you know what, I talked to the local imam here and had several appointments with him, trying to kind of just seek his support. Actually, I felt safe around him. He was very nice and somewhat, relatable in terms of being my generation and having kids and blah blah blah. But the same person who said that we're traditionalists, it was as if because he put himself in that box and I wasn't in that box, it meant that I didn't qualify for that love or support. And I'm very open about being like, a suicide survivor, a suicide researcher, and almost to the point where like people just can't take it. And I actually have recently begun to start acknowledging that, yeah, I have to have compassion for these people, because they might themselves be, avoidant copers who have buried away a lot of stuff. And so we have to have compassion. And so sometimes it's not the stigma, it's just avoidant coping too.
Yeah. No, agreed. Like if people haven't done that internal work, they won't be able to meet other people, and you can't help other people heal effectively if you haven't done your own healing. You know what I mean? Like
exactly. And imams and stuff are in a very critical position where they can foster that healing because they have the mic in community spaces.
Right.
And so I was telling him, like, with your mic, you should endorse me publicly. Like, you should come out and be like, look at Amelia's work. We need to be focusing on this. That's all she does is talk about suicide. She's an expert. And, because I can't dismantle the stigma alone. The way to do this from public health intervention perspective is you have to actually target people who are trusted in the community and have them deliver the message. So like, for example, at the khutbahs and the sermons and the halaqas, like that's where you insert these narratives of like life preservation and the morals of the beauty of life in Islam and all those things, but also the understanding of trauma and all that and violence. And and suicide. And so I was telling him, like, you know, and I essentially need your help. I need your help. And because he asked me, like, I can't help you. Like, you have all, I was like telling him, like, how I feel rejected in the community. And he's like, well, this is an issue that you just need to talk to with your therapist. And I'm just like, you're not listening, buddy. Like,
Yeah.
you're not listening to me. You're not hearing me. I'm telling you that I literally have the formula for helping prevent suicide. And by the way, we've had a youth suicide in our community. There was a Black kid who went to Islamic school, 9 years old, died by suicide because of bullying from the teacher. And that kid is Black, by the way, or of African origin, Muslim kid. And so that's what I don't get. I'm like, and so he responded back. He's like, yeah, but I don't support everything. I don't have unconditional support for even my family. And I sat there, and we had to end our call because he was very strict about the time. And that's another thing that actually is a trigger for me for my panic attacks, is when I feel like my voice is being silenced or I'm not being heard and I can't speak 100% and speak to the full end. And with men, especially like leadership positions, like religious leaders, that's where my spiritual trauma really occurs, is feeling silenced. And so I didn't even get to finish the conversation with him. Otherwise, I would have told him that literally that element that you're doing, that conditional love, that conditional support is, and not having that for your family particularly, is literally the reason why our kids are suicidal, because they're not growing up in family environments that are supportive, welcoming, belonging, accepting, humanizing. They're just rejecting. Reject this part of you, reject that part of you, reject this, reject that. And so they internalize this rejection and they hate themselves for it, and they feel guilty and ashamed of themselves. And when I talk about suicide prevention, I have several phrases. You know, one of them is kindness equals suicide prevention. And another one is unconditional love is suicide prevention.
Yeah. Yeah. And that community care. That community care. We can be doing such a better job. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not even talking about this from like just a personal perspective. Let's talk about the science. So there's this theory of suicide called the interpersonal theory of suicide by Thomas Joyner, and that's the basis of my dissertation. And there are some critiques about this particular theory, but those critiques don't take away from the major point here, which is that rejection from society leads to a loss of belongingness. And out of the components that contribute to suicidality, which include, you know, being perceived burdenness, right? So being perceived as a burden to your family. You feel like, oh my God, you know, I'm not worthy of their anything. So I'm just a burden to them. And then there's the capacity, which means like fearlessness. So if you're fearless of pain and you're not afraid that the pain is going to hurt or going to kill you, then you have the acquired capacity for suicide. And then the third component is the belongingness. And he argues that the belongingness is actually the strongest of the three in terms of predicting suicidal attempt and death. And that is that if you're not accepted, or if you don't have a sense of belongingness, then your suicidality, like your ideation and your behaviors, are going to be inevitable, essentially, because these three things. And I literally also just came out of a seminar yesterday talking about where I actually I didn't meet him, but he was also explaining all this. And for anyone who's out there, here are some signs that he shared of when someone is suicidal. So these are kind of more immediate signs. So someone that might be more preeminently in a thought process or preeminently planning. A sign is that you're withdrawn. You're psychologically and emotionally distant, kind of like they're in their thoughts. They have a sense of resignation, hopelessness, remoteness within a person. So that isolation, flatness to their talk, their speech, flatness to their actions, you know, slowness, woodenness is what he called it. Not a lot of emotionality, not even blinking eyes when they talk. So, you know, when you talk, there's like, I don't know, average of like, I don't know how many he said, 3 blinks per every second, or I mean every few seconds or something, I don't know, but there was a video of someone who was actively suicidal recording their speech, and they were just talking like this.
Mm.
And you know, and other behaviors are feeling agitation, pacing, shutdown behaviors like stopped eating, insomnia, weight loss, crying, wringing hands. You know, these are the things that ultimately, when we talk about suicide, we must, as a Muslim community, recognize how critical a sense of belonging is, and accepting yourself and humanizing yourself is a key kind of variable in promoting that belongingness at a community level.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to just say, like, even if we're not seeing the clear signs, because people can hide their
Absolutely.
pain, right?
And I did it.
Yeah. I think what's most important is just what we can do as community members to help start building towards this like community rooted in unconditional love, is just practice it personally, right?
For yourself.
So yeah, so work on your own healing, accept your own humanity. I'm listing them off like they're so easy to do. These are complex processes, but actively working on it, right? Like accepting your own humanity, like working on yourself, going to therapy, dealing with your pain, right? Acknowledging how your pain might, um, you know, shape your perspective of the world and how you interact with people. And then, you know, when you're interacting with folks, interacting from a place of true humility and compassion. And, you know, that will help, you know, then even whether you're seeing the signs in someone or not, when you interact with someone with humility and compassion, it is a healing interaction, right? And so whether you're seeing clear signs in someone of suicidality, or if they're hiding it, like that humility and compassion can create a very healing moment, right? And and then as we work on just being more transparent, and like actively working from that place of humility, we can work towards building communities that are more rooted in unconditional love, and that can lower suicidality, right?
Yes.
And foster a sense of belonging for Muslims in a world where there is also a lot of rejection outside of the Muslim community. We didn't even touch on that. That's a whole other discussion. But I think what we can do is just start here, start with our own community, and creating spaces in our own community that foster a sense of belonging, and unconditional love. So, yeah.
Yes. And if you are not privy to those spaces, if that is not something that is readily available to you, because I sure as hell am still searching for my own.
Yeah.
I suggest going to a therapist and exploring your own rejection sensitivity. So like what you have to start having a really, really strong gauge for when you're feeling rejected, or what things make you feel rejected, and what kind of persona you've had to build up, like you said, to survive. And I'm also a big survivalist from a theoretical perspective. I tie everything back to survival. And that's one of the reasons why I chose you, because I think we have very similar worldviews. And so we have to really ask ourselves through meditative practices like breathing and engaging in mindfulness, mostly mindfulness. We have to be in our body and ask ourselves constantly, like, what am I doing right now that is making me perceive myself as being rejected or not included or not belonging? And, you know, I think that, I don't know if there's a generational component to it, but I will say that people's own self-rejection is what gets projected onto their children. And so because they cannot accept themselves for who they are, they cannot accept their kids for who they are. And then you have family estrangement, you have abandonment issues, you have neglect issues, and those are formulaic for suicidality. So inshallah, I really feel like if there's one thing that this conversation has boiled down to, is the connections between that trauma and rejection and suicidality and all the other components that relate to those.
Yeah. Like, again, accepting your humanity, being mindful, like living with intentionality and being conscious of your thoughts. Like these are all things that take time to learn, and going to therapy can really help you do that, right?
Mhm.
And so yeah, I think that's solid advice, is to try, you can try to find a therapist that can work with you on these things. um yeah, and
Yeah.
we can work together by working on ourselves. We can work together to really like lower suicidality in our communities. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Inshallah. Alrighty. So you want to do a little dua?
Like me lead the door? Or are you gonna?
Want to do? We could both just pitch in.
Okay, sure.
Oh Allah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Oh Allah, please guide our ummah to healing, toward healing. You are Shafi, you are the healer. Oh
Give us,
Allah.
yeah, Ola, please give us the courage and compassion to face ourselves and face our pain, and work towards being more compassionate and people who lead with humility.
Ameen. And oh Allah, you are Al-Hayy and you preserve life. So allow us to see the value in life, and allow our children and our elders and us ourselves, allow us to see how beautiful life is, and grant us the rizq, because you are a razak, grant us the sustenance to maintain a livelihood that is sufficient for us and makes us feel fulfilled. Ameen.
I mean, that was very well thought out.
Ameen. Alhamdulillah. Alrighty, sis. I feel like we need to like decompress from this conversation.
I'm probably gonna go watch Parks and Rec now.
Yeah, I'm gonna chill. I'm gonna go onto my sofa and watch MasterChef Legends, because that's
Yeah. Yeah. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you.
there for being here, honestly.
Yeah, honestly, like this was a healing dialogue for me. um, I really appreciate it. I know that we were all over the place, but I think it just really reflects the complexity of suicide. And I really hope that like folks found benefit in this conversation, inshallah. Yeah.
I definitely think they will. And you know what? I think that also, I want to say one last thing, and that is that I put on an exterior that's extremely strong and extremely, like put together. And honestly, that's the last type of person I am. I'm just a really good actor. And I think that that's why so much of my suicidality never registered on anyone's radar. And when I came out as a survivor, it was like earth shattering for people. So, and many of us, this is a story I hear a lot, very common. It's the people that people love the most, that everyone just loves and is popular. Check in on it. Check in on those people. Those are the people who are really, really suffering on the inside, probably the most.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Decompress. All right.
Let me stop.